Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
The Cool Talk series. My name is Shobana Balakrishnan. I run the Cool Talk series for MSR. And these are a set of talks that we do regularly, pretty regularly, twice a month or so, just to reach out to everyone in Microsoft, the product groups in particular, the business groups. And it's mostly talking about technologies, interesting trends, innovations, coming from MSR that we think have broader impact. This, of course, has broader impact to all of us, and it's a very interesting talk. So David is new to Microsoft, came from Yahoo Research. Just recently, we have a whole new lab in New York City that is a new Microsoft Research Lab, all housing about 15 researchers.
That's correct.
Several of whom are some economists, some behavioral psychologists, and some machine learning people. Yes. Yeah, that's the sort of expertise there. And they're all applied. They've been, working for various lengths at Yahoo. David, in particular, has been there only a year at Yahoo.
That's correct.
And prior to that, got his PhD from the Wharton School, Applied Economics. So with that, I'll hand it over to David. Take it away. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you guys, and thank you guys for coming today. It has been a pleasure being at Microsoft. Of course, we've only been here for a few months, but it's been working out very nicely. So our entire lab's excited about it. Today's talk is talking about forecasting, in particular focusing in on the 2012 election in the end, but really focusing on the idea of forecasting for economics and related topics as well as politics, and I'll get into that in a second. But when it comes to elections, this is big business. Upwards of $10 billion are going to be spent on the 2012 election cycle. So this is a very serious industry. And not only that, is that similar techniques that are developed thinking about economics and thinking about how to gather information for forecasting politics is coming into political economy questions, marketing type questions, economic indicators, et cetera. Pretty much anything in which I'm talking about an upcoming election, you could be thinking about how much copies of Halo 4 is going to be sold, or what kind of genes are going to be popular next year, or whether or not people are going to use the new initiatives in Obamacare. So any sort of these types of questions in which individuals are making some sort of collective action, the same sort of forecasting techniques can be utilized. And the kind of scary thing about it, though, is that the forecasting that is used and used to make really serious investment decisions hasn't changed very much since 1936. So in 1936, George Gallup came up with the idea of randomly polling a representative group of people and using that as a basis for a forecast of what's going to happen in an election. And if you froze him after the 1936 election and thawed him out today, he would be pretty comfortable with what is being done to find data for a $10 billion industry. But that's going to change very quickly, and it's going to change in the next 5 to 10 years. And I'm going to talk today about how a lot of that innovation is going to be coming out of our lab and other related labs in Microsoft Research, and how it's going to impact not just politics, but also hopefully have some really neat implications for Microsoft as well. So when you think about forecasting, and you think about forecasting elections, the first data point that comes to mind is going to be these polls of voter intention. So if an election were held today, who would you vote for? This is the standard, ubiquitous data point that's been around since the 1920s and perfected by George Gallup in the 30s. But in addition to that, there's kind of 4 other groups where I put data that you do hear about, and sometimes you don't think about in the same sort of way. But kind of fundamental data is all this stuff that people talk about where they imply that it has some sort of correlation with the outcome, but a lot of times they don't really go into how or the exact mechanism, but past election results, incumbency, presidential approval ratings, even for Senate and House races and governor's races, economic indicators, what's the latest job reports. Prediction markets. For those of you who aren't familiar with prediction markets are actual real money markets where people can buy and sell contracts which pay off if a candidate wins and don't pay off if a candidate loses. And they become very strong indicators of the probability of an event happening. So if it costs 60 cents for a contract that pays $1 if Barack Obama wins, which is essentially the case right now, that's a very closely aligned with about a 60% probability from the collective people in the market. Experts, they can say whatever they want, and social media. So social media has just started to be coming into its own. Twitter data, Facebook data, search data, all sorts of real-time data in which people are trying to think of how do these correlate with outcomes of different events. And so I'm going to focus first in this talk on the ubiquitous poll, and I'm going to be talking about how stuff that we've learned in research about prediction markets is going to help shape how the poll is going to transform over the next few cycles. So this kind of outlines the key differences between prediction markets and polls. And I'm going to walk through this, but I want to keep something in mind too, is that research into polling, which has been fairly stagnant over the years, is a totally different track than research into prediction markets. And it's kind of weird because essentially these are just two different ways to engage individuals, gather information for them, aggregate it together, and then say something about something. Say something about some upcoming event, get a data point. But yet no one has really kind of worked to kind of bring the two together and think about how they differ and how they share similarities. Polling likes to think about gathering a random sample of a representative group of something. So in elections, it's likely voters. For marketing, it's going to be likely people in the market for Xbox or for jeans or whatever you're talking about. Prediction markets rely on a self-selected group of people who have superior information to join a market, bid on contracts, and provide that information. Self-selecting group. Questions. Prediction markets focus in on asking the expectation of what's going to happen. They're asking people about whether or not something's going to hit or not, whether or not someone's going to win an election, whether or not sales figures are going to go across a certain threshold. And polling focuses on the intentions. So the same thing in marketing it is in politics. Will you buy this product? Will you go see this movie? Will you vote on this election? Who will you vote for in this election? Aggregation. Polls focus in on simple aggregation methods, generally averaging or some sort of weighted average based on some prior demographics. Polls use, prediction markets proxy for how much money you're willing to spend as some sort of proxy for confidence. So if you're allowed to put more money into it, if you feel really confident, you can bid up in a prediction markets. And finally, incentives. Polling is generally not incentive controlled. So the incentives may align for people to be telling the truth, they may not, and there's a lot of questions about that. Versus prediction markets, which are directly assigned to have properly aligned incentives so that you are supposed to be able to bid up to about the probability that you feel that something is when you place a purchase order. Now I'm going to focus in, though, first on this questions. So polling, they focus in on intention questions. Prediction markets focus in on expectation questions. Is there something we thought about here where you can kind of go into polling and see maybe if expectation questions make a difference? So when polling individuals in order to forecast an upcoming election, generally you have this, voter intention. Who would you vote for if the election were held today? The wording is pretty much identical for any of the major news sources that you see, from Rasmussen to Gallup to Fox News's polls to ABC's polls and MSNBC. It's all the same. Voter expectation question. Voter expectation question would look something like this. Who do you think will win the election? Regardless of who you're going to vote for, who do you think is going to win the election? And the reason that this interests us a lot is this idea that everyone has a pool of information, whether about an upcoming event, such as an election, or whether or not it's a marketing question. So on elections, we know a lot of things. We know who we're going to vote for. We know who our friends and family are going to vote for. We've seen the news. We know what other people are talking about it. And when you ask someone their intentions, you're getting a small sliver, a very small sliver of that data, right? You're getting just that individual's intention over it. Expectation is going to respond with something about their individual information, as well as information about their social network, as well as other centralized information. And this is the key motivating factor behind it. And so in order to compare it, we were able to, and this is work with a co-author of mine, Justin Wolfers, who is at Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. We were able to find a data set, a collected data set essentially, 345 times, where the same people at the same time were asked who they're going to vote for in an election and who they thought was going to win, and specifically in state-by-state electoral votes that went from 1952 until 2008. And this is the basis of the data. 345 races. 217 of the times, they both had greater than 50%. Both their expectation and their intention pointed towards the winner of the election. 45 races, or 13% of the time, they both pointed to the eventual loser. 82 races, or 83 races, 24% of the time, one poll, so the same people at the same time, more than 50% of people intended to vote for one candidate, more than 50% of people expected the other candidate to win. And by the way, just to be clear, we're talking here about the major party candidates. So we dropped people who intended to vote for a third party candidate and or expected to vote for expected a third party candidate to win, in which case no third party candidates have won, so it wasn't as relevant. 3/4 of the time, the expectation question points to the eventual winner. 1/4 of the time, the intention question pointed to the eventual winner. And so, just on the sake of this kind of binary outcome, it's pretty clear that there's a lot of information coming from this expectation question. But to kind of head off some very obvious questions about this, first of all is that there are many examples in here and many more examples in life where there is no intention poll kind of publicized before the election. So one of the first things you're thinking of is, oh, people can do expectations well because they probably saw the intention poll. But a lot of these states, you're not really seeing publicized intention polls before the election. Second thing I would mention is that we actually, part of the research, which I'm not going to show today, is that we gathered an amount of about several hundred, actually, of times where this type of question was asked prior to intention polls. So prior to 1936, we gathered a data set from 1880 to 1932 in which people were asked who they thought was going to win in certain elections, and showed that it actually provided a lot of information even prior to the availability of any sort of polls of voter intention. But more importantly, I think, for kind of this example, I'm thinking about major races where there are intention polls, what we're able to show here is that when both intention polls and expectation polls are available, there's a time where intention polls are very, very poor. Let's say there's a very small sample size or there isn't a good sample selection. Expectation polls dominate and provide just tons more information. In the most advantageous position for intention polls, perfectly run, large sample size, major polling companies, et cetera, expectation polls still carry more weight than the intention polls. Also, we have individual level data for these 345 races, and we're able to show that there's an extreme amount of heterogeneity. So if you think about it, if everyone just expected whoever they voted for to win, then there'd be the intention poll and expectation polls would be the same. If everyone was seeing the same thing from the media, then everyone would expect the same thing regardless of their intention. What we see is a massive amount of heterogeneity, which shows there's some middle ground. There's information coming from the center, coming from this kind of social network data or coming from some other thing besides just your intention and the central signal. And finally, I think this is most important for some reasons too, is that even if there's an extremely well-publicized intention poll, which one would you rather ask somebody? If you only asked one person and you ask them their intention, there's a close race, there's about a 55% chance they may be right, a 45% chance they may be wrong in that sense. But if you ask them their expectation, there's a much higher likelihood you're going to be right. And this kind of carries over, this kind of basic idea carries over through this idea of asking this question. So now, of course, just the binary outcome is nice, but that's not really what a lot of people care about at the end of the day. Especially when it comes to forecasting, people think about expected vote share. So what I have down here on the x-axis is the proportion of people who intend to vote Democratic. So this is the polls that we just talked about on the last slide, although I've dropped 2008 from here because that becomes out of sample. And so this is 311 different elections. This is the proportion of people who intend to vote Democratic. And the y-axis is the actual vote share. Now, this is what you see a lot on the news, is a kind of naive, implicit vote share. And what we're going to see is that there definitely is an upward slope here. Definitely, the higher the poll, the more votes end up getting. But it's clearly not a 1-for-1 ratio, right? So this naive vote share is not that great. And so we do some very clean and transparent calculations where we say that the poll essentially equals the actual vote share plus some sort of House bias, plus some any sort of party or incumbency bias, plus some sort of time bias. Most of these actually are clear. We don't have much time variation. They're all taken about 30 days before the election, plus some sort of error term. And we're able to translate the raw polling data into an expected vote share, and it looks something like this. Now, the interesting thing, though, is when you look at expectations. So on the x-axis is the proportion of people who expect the Democrat to win, and the y-axis is the actual vote share. It doesn't look that clean. It doesn't really show very much. And this is one of the reasons why people have not been using this poll for very much, because if there's a 90% of people expect a candidate to win, what does that mean? I mean, it could be a close race, but everyone still knows that the outcome is going to be, or it could be a very wide race. And so implicitly, it doesn't look like expected vote share, and it doesn't look like probability of victory. It doesn't look like much at all, actually. There's an upward slope to it. The higher the expectation, the more people expect a candidate to win, the more votes they end up getting, but clearly not 1-to-1. But we do the same transformation. It's the exact same transformation we use for intentions, and this is what we get. And it may not be clean because you didn't see the other one right next to it. So if you look at the two of them right next to it, being on the 45-degree line means parity. That means that the expected vote share coming from that poll equals the outcome. And you can see, just looking at these, that the expectation data translates into a much cleaner looking forecast of the actual vote share. For the numbers people, we can just show that when you take the expectation data, which is the second column, and turn that into an expected vote share versus the first column, which is the intention data, into then an expected vote share, you have a lower root mean square error, lower mean absolute error. It's closer to the forecast. The forecast is closer to the answer more often, higher correlation, incumbency regression. But this is the kind of thing which I like to focus on, is this last slide here, this last number here, is that if we were to put a weight on which forecast we would take, you get tons of significance and a lot of weight on the expectation, and you get a little bit and no significance on the intention. And to be clear here, what major polling companies use is 100% and 0, right? So even if you don't totally buy it, right here we have a very, very strong finding in which is essentially 100% and 0 in the other direction. So we wanted to think more about what this means and how this could help us beyond just this question. And in many ways, we wanted to kind of interpret the power of it as well. So let me just give you a quick interpretation. Imagine if when people are asked their expectation over what was going to happen in an election, they went out and they just polled random voters on the street. They just polled random voters on the street. The data is as powerful for expectation as if they went out and they interviewed 10 random voters and then included themselves in it. So essentially, if they just gave us a binary answer, Democrat or Republican, based off a poll of 11 people, which was them plus 10 additional people. We don't think they're actually doing that, obviously. But that just kind of shows the power of asking this question versus the other question. So there's this massive multiplicative effect. It's like having a poll of 10 times as many people. But not just 10 times as many people. It also solves one of the hardest questions in polling, which is, what's the representative sample? So when polls report a margin of error, when you see Gallup has a margin of error plus or minus 2 or plus or minus 3, what they're reporting to you is the random sample error if they knew exactly what the likely voters were going to look like. So if they knew the demographic breakdown on election day of who was going to show up, and then they went out and polled 1,000 people, that plus or minus 3%, plus or minus 2%, that's the random sample error based off the fact they only interviewed 1,000 versus, a million or everyone. But it misses this other major source of error, which is that they don't know who's going to vote. And they're having this likely voter model, which is a lot of guessing work. And that's why in the 2008 election, the day before the election, of the major polls that came out, and pretty much every major polling company had polls came out, they ranged from Obama up by 2 to Obama up by 11. And it wasn't just from random sampling error. It had a lot to do with this hard problem of thinking about likely voters. But that's not what actually happens. So we want to figure out more about what actually happens. And as we said, there's this idea about, there's this, we know that the people's intentions involved. We know there's something about this localized information they have. And we know there's something about the central signal. And so one of the things that we're working on is we actually have a bunch of stuff in the field, actually with Gallup, which I've been working on prior to getting here. And then also we're going to be asking these questions inside Microsoft's network with Xbox and with some other platform, in which we're going to be asking people about not just their expectation and intention, but asking who their friends and family are voting for, who they think that the media is saying is going to win, and trying to put all this together to actually break down the information we're getting. Because the question about expectation is the question we had to use because it was asked before, or as Donald Rumsfeld said, you go to war with what you have, not with what you want. What we want doesn't involve the central signal, because I'm the leading expert in the world on what the central signal is. So I don't want people regurgitating to me what they think the polls are saying, because I can do that with less noise than they can. I want to know what they're providing me about their friends and family. I want to be able to ask a poll and get that information and thinking about the social network data that's coming from it. And that would be the ideal, and that's what we're experimenting on this year. Let me show you a little bit in the field this year. So as I said, we've been working with Gallup. So Gallup's been kind enough to be asking these questions for us. This was taken in November during the Republican primary. And what you'll see at this point, Romney and Kaine, if you remember him, were in a dead heat. But when we asked them their expectations, Romney dominated. Later, 1 month later, you had Romney getting crushed by Kaine. Kaine was, sorry, not Kaine, Gingrich. Sorry, it just kept on floating around, so I forget who was leading at different points. There was actually, in the intention polls, there was about 15 different leaders. It was like one leader, then Romney, another leader, then Romney, and it switched back and forth. The expectation poll, even at the lowest point, and this would be about the lowest point, never wavered. So every time we asked the expectation poll, that always said Romney, even when he was being dominated in the intention poll. So there's clearly something that people knew when they were coming into these that was providing us meaningful information. And so what do we have right now? We have a mix of polls up there. So if you look up at a Real Clear Politics or Pollster, which takes the latest polls up there, I think this was Real Clear Politics that pulled this down 2 days ago. They had Obama up in 4 different intention polls. They had Romney up in 3, and they did tie in 2. Not all of them had expectation polls, but every one we found so far in this entire cycle has Obama up. A good example would be the latest Washington Times poll, in which they have Romney up 42.8% to 42, almost a tie in the intention, but they still have Obama up big time in expectation. So let me talk about sample selection now. So this is a pretty interesting thing, because the way the polls are worked, and this is in for everything, we spend a massive amount of money and time thinking about this representative sample. And it's the basis of all of this kind of polling has always been to gather representative samples, random groups of representative samples. But what we're able to show with the same sort of data is that I can take the most biased, unrepresentative sample possible. Just those people who said they're going to vote Democratic, or just those people who say vote Republican, and actually create a more accurate forecast than the whole group. And why is this important? Declining landline penetration, unrepresentative online surveys, difficult contacting working families, 20–30% in some demographic groups don't have landlines anymore. Pew ran a survey recently and showed that getting people onto standard random digit dialing polling, which is the standard, gold standard, 9% is what people are averaging now of how much you can gather. They did a kind of gold-plated one where they got up into like the 20s by like calling 35 times or something crazy like that. If you could take non-represented samples, like Microsoft and other major corporations handle millions in any given day, billions, right, of non-representative people who ping them for different things, and ask them simple questions, and you can make it work for you, then you got something going. And another thing to think about is that, you know, in contrast to the polls, and just going back to prediction markets are dominated by generally elderly or kind of people in their 40s and 50s, overwhelmingly wealthy and white and male. this is a very unrepresentative group, and they've done a very good job in predicting outcomes of elections. Just to be really clear what we're doing in this, standard. You take all of the poll, people who say they're going to vote Democratic, people who say they're Republican, that's your voter intention. Expectations, let's take the whole poll, all the people involved, the whole sample, expectations. What we're able to do here is, by accounting for the correlation between intentions and expectations, we're able to take roughly half the sample size, either just those people who are going to vote Democratic or just those people who vote Republican, and able to get a more accurate forecast of the upcoming election. So I'm not going to go into the math because I'm not going to have time here, but this was really big because this kind of showed us that we don't need to do polling on fully representative samples. If we have some historical data and if we have some understanding about debiasing, we can actually make unrepresentative samples work for us. I'm going to go over this real quickly because I'll be low on time, which I am. Aggregation methods and incentives. So what are we thinking about here? We're thinking about here is a combination of gamification and new graphical interfaces. And so this is what we call the ball and buckets method, which we've been working on, in which we get lay people with non-experts, and they fill up, we ask them a question, we have them fill up the different distributions between the different ranges, and actually they end up creating a probability distribution. So we ask them in this case about quantity of something they're in ounces. We ask them, say, where's the answer likely to fall? They push these up until they distribute 100% likelihood across these things. And we've been able to show that people have been able to create really amazingly good distributions, normal distributions, uniform distributions, right distribution, less distributions, really able to show their confidence and their kind of full understanding of where the answer may be able to lie. More importantly, we've been also developing other things which are actually less cumbersome, which are just kind of fun games that people have been playing in order to provide information for us. And what it's doing is two things. Number one is that it's allowing people to reveal their confidence over their answer, reveal their confidence without being a money-based thing, without being having money as a proxy for it, because what we're showing is that confidence as the standard deviation of their probability distributions is highly correlated to how accurate they've been. So we've had people play these games like this. The tighter their standard deviation, the tighter their distribution, the more accurate they've been. So we've been able to use that to weight forecasts based on it. And second thing we've been able to show is that if we make the games fun, if we have people have incentives beyond money, we can actually incentivize them properly to give us meaningful and truthful answers without having to make it a money-based game. And so, in short, when we're thinking about polling and how we're going to help transform it, is that previously, basically everything's been based on this random sample of representative. We're switching to the idea that we can use random sample or even self-selected samples of non-representative groups. Questions, we're trying to think of the intersection between intentions, expectations, and people's social network, rather than just relying on people's intentions. We're working on weighting by revealed confidence, and we're working on making things incentive compatible by gamifying things, rather than thinking about having to make sure everything is money-based. And so redefining polling by having polls meet prediction markets. And where's this kind of be useful moving forward, too, is that obviously Microsoft has massive amounts of engaged non-representative users. And so in this election cycle, we're going to be asking some of these questions, a lot of these questions, and pushing it forward with experiments on the Xbox, where people are going to have the opportunity to answer polling as well on some other platforms. And the idea being that we hope to be able to create very meaningful forecasts, predictions, as well as also some analysis on sentiment and interest from these people coming from this non-representative group. Furthermore, we're also running some experimental games, which we're running off of Microsoft right now because these are not advanced enough, but we've been toying with them. And the idea of making even more advanced prediction markets, which we're excited about, can really utilize and really be a lot of fun for people. But I should also put a caveat here on this question of non-representative, is that our user base is not necessarily representative of likely voters, but it is representative of Xbox users, and it is representative of Microsoft users. And it's also somewhat representative or close to representative of a lot of demographics that are important to a lot of people. So the ability to also do some really cool market research, some advertising research, and some other very useful and very direct things is not lost on us by the fact that we don't need a perfectly representative, but reasonably representative stuff hit randomly or hit even self-selectively our ability to start debiasing that data and thinking, well, I'd rather just have this many more hits and not be representative. If we can debias it properly, we can actually answer some really awesome questions and with some massive scale. So let me start putting this into a little more context. So I'm going to kind of put things into 3 categories here. So what I just talked about is kind of active Microsoft data. This is data that we're going to start collecting in different realms with experimental polling, experimental games. On the far left, this is kind of passive outside data that is generally used in making predictions for both kind of marketing type questions as well as election type questions. And the middle, kind of all referred to as passive Microsoft data. This is Microsoft data that we have that we don't actively cull for this use. Now, the really interesting thing is when you start thinking about this in terms of election forecasting, a lot of stuff stops at this kind of passive level, right? So you hear a lot of people report the latest daily poll, but they don't kind of translate that into expected vote share for you or probability of victory or something. People talk about the latest jobless numbers and say this is important, but they're not. There's ways to translate that into what does it really mean? Like, does a 10% tick up in the unemployment rate, what does that do? Same thing with Twitter. Everyone loves to report raw Twitter numbers. You know, there was this many retweets of something. What does that mean? Like, put that in context. Is how many tweets are normal, right? And so the idea really of what this kind of greater project this falls into is taking all of this data, this passive outside data, this passive Microsoft data, this active data we're culling, and really work it into real-time data visualizations and tables in which there'll be internal dashboards in which people can utilize to learn about different things, as well as for external market research type things, and then external facing charts and tables that try to take all of this data into aggregate it together into very clean kind of predictions of things, social media interests in things, and sentiment around things. And so that's kind of the overall kind of goal. So this is kind of the second stage. So before I was talking about the first stage, let's talk a little bit about the second stage. And so when you think about this in terms of forecasts, the idea is to gather this information and aggregate it. And I kind of think about it in 4 kind of key things. 1 is thinking about accuracy. 2 is thinking about timeliness. 3 is thinking about the relevancy of the forecast. And 4 is about the economic efficiency. And so what do I mean by these things? So let's think about accuracy. I'm going to talk a lot about combining data. And so what you see a lot of is the people providing you individual data streams. But I don't inherently care about Twitter. I care about what Twitter can forecast for me, or what it tells me about sentiment, about interest. You know, I don't inherently care about Gallup's polls versus Rasmussen's polls, right? I care about the forecast they're trying to project. So it doesn't make much sense, the fact that people don't think about this. And what the first type of thing is to think about kind of within data type aggregation. So you get a benefit from aggregating Rasmussen's polls in Gallup's polls and taking an average. It's pretty much always better than grabbing one versus the other. Debiasing it. So with polling, we know that there are biases, whether or not it's from in polling, there's something called the anti-incumbency bias. So incumbents poll lower around Labor Day or a couple months before the election than they actually do in the outcome. And these are very simple things that you can debias. Combining different data streams together, combining prediction markets and polls is their advantage to it, and then kind of debiasing the whole thing together. And I'll give you even more examples. So this is data from 2008. And so essentially what you're seeing here in the blue line is all polling for the national election. And I have aggregated the different polling together by taking simply a linear trend on any given day of the previous polls. And then I did a very simple debiasing method, which is very transparent, and created a probability of victory. That's the blue line. And this is for the incumbent party, which was the Republican Party. So this was McCain. And what you see is he floats around 40%, pretty stable. And then Lehman goes under, and his likelihood of winning the election just crashes towards 0. Now, what if I'd done the same method, but I had just taken the daily polls on any given day? So rather taking a trend of all the previous polls together, I just took whatever the latest poll that came out was. That's what the exact same thing would look like. And this is what you're getting, basically, right, when you turn on the evening news. People are talking about that latest poll about Obama, or maybe there are 2 polls out today and they average them together for you. But there's really no reason to believe that the underlying value of this election was bouncing around like that on a daily basis. it's pretty safe to say that it looked a lot more like this blue line. And so this is what happens when you just kind of do some basic within data aggregation. So let me talk about prediction markets then. So people like to report prediction market prices, and it's been pretty clear with the research that prediction market prices, as far as raw data goes, are a really strong indication of probability of victory. But this says polls from about 2 days ago. What you'll see on the top line there is Michigan. So this is the top line in yellow is essentially a contract that pays off, let's assume at 100, should Obama carry Michigan, and pays off to 0 if he loses. But what you see, there's a pretty big difference here between the bid. So people are willing to spend 75, and the ask. People are willing to sell it for 86. And then the last purchase was at 73. So it's not exactly obvious what the price is and what the number to pull from this is. What we generally take is something that is actually, in order to do this in real time, is actually a pretty long string of if and but conditions, which comes out to something roughly between the middle of the bid and the ask, unless the spread gets too large. But then there's something else, which is a question of debiasing, which is you'll see Maine here sitting at somewhere around 97 or 96. That will never go any higher because of transaction costs and opportunity costs. No one's actually going to bid Maine all the way up to 100. And we know this, and we see that systematically. So we have ways to kind of say, let's debias what we call the favorite long shot bias, which is that really slow contracts tend to move up slightly higher than they should, and really high contracts don't go all the way to 100. This is from another set of research which I've done using kind of fundamental data. So this is created based off of past election results, and combined with economic indicators, incumbency, and other things like that. And what you can see is that pretty early before the election, you can actually take all this data, aggregate all these different kind of data sources together, and create a pretty accurate forecast of what the expected vote share is to be. So the x-axis is the kind of forecast that I can create on June 15th of an election year. The y-axis accounts for the actual outcome. And what you see is it's a pretty nice line. But it does speak to this question of when people just talk about job numbers or talk about things like this. We spend a lot of time thinking about how do they actually correlate in. If you actually think about it, you can actually break it down. I can see, the trend in job numbers, how important that is, how much does incumbency buy you. And that's why you kind of want to create these models and think about it more in this kind of fully debiased form. But that being said, this is taking that kind of fundamental data, adding it to prediction market data and polling data. And this is from, I guess, the last few cycles, both presidential and senatorial races. This is the kind of main forecast model I use. This is how accurate it can be 103 days before the election. 103 days before the election, obviously, is today. I didn't pick that number just randomly. But so this is the forecast that my model had created for the last couple of election cycles, about 202 races. So it's the last three senatorial cycles and last 2 presidential cycles. And you can get pretty darn accurate if you start pulling all this data together. And this will just get more and more accurate as the election approaches because more and more information is added to prediction markets or polls or fundamental, which are the main inputs going into this model. So now on the question of timeliness, this has always been something that just bugged me in the sense that academia and the press tend to judge forecasts for almost anything. This includes economic indicators especially, right before something comes out when it's almost completely meaningless. So whether or not you can forecast the jobless rate 3 minutes before the jobless rate comes out, or generally they come out a day to 5 days beforehand, you can't make major decisions based off that, right? Essentially, you need that data coming when you need it. And the earlier you can make these predictions, the more valuable it is to actually make investment decisions. And so I work on making sure that all these forecasts are updated in real time so they're as relevant when you need it. And it actually adds a massive layer of complexity that we're working with because of things like prediction markets breaking down. It can get confusing when there's no bid and ask in some prediction market, how you write the right code in order to make all this stuff work. And then second of all, the granular nature of creating forecasts that update all the time makes it so that you could do some really awesome research about the effect of different things. So if I have a forecast that literally moves in real time and someone, say, announces a surprise VP candidate, you can actually see how quickly and how precisely this moves, these forecasts move, and that allows you to study things that you can't study if you have a forecast that comes out once a month or something. And so the question of relevancy, too. And so generally, as you know, with elections, the first thing that people talk about is the raw poll numbers. This is raw data, right? And hopefully you can kind of see from what I was talking about today, is that it's very easy to make it into something a lot more meaningful. But yet what people generally report is raw data, raw number of tweets, raw number on a poll, the price on a prediction market, the jobless number. These stuff doesn't help most people. This is raw data. But then you can kind of transform it into the most popular thing is to some sort of estimation of vote share. But most people don't actually care about estimation of vote share. The reason that estimation of vote share has been the kind of granddaddy of forecasting for elections is because it's the easiest forecast to make, and polls implicitly look like it. But most stakeholders don't care if Obama wins by negative points if he lawlessly wins the election, and they don't care if he wins by 1,000. What they care about is who wins. And so probability of victory is actually what most stakeholders have shown they care about, but what very few forecasts focus on. And because it's a little harder to make and a little different. But trying to think about these things is some of the things that we've been thinking about a lot in trying to make whatever we create, whether or not they're sentiment index or interest index or predictions, more relevant. And so finally, kind of social media data. And I apologize if I didn't talk enough about social media data today, but the bottom line is that there's a lot of ongoing work on it. But currently, people embarrass themselves frequently when they talk about social media data in the popular press and also in academia, too. And the reason is because there's very hard to calibrate social media data with outcomes at this point because social media data has changed so rapidly and there's so few outcomes to correlate them with. And the bigger problem, though, comes with this very, very hard problem of people taking this raw data and then confusing it with many different types of outcomes, not being clear what they're talking about. Are they talking about how much people are interested in something, what they think is going to happen, or the sentiment around it? And a good example would be Ron Paul, which was getting a lot of news during the primary, was the fact that Ron Paul was dominating social media. And so a lot of media people kind of made an ass of themselves by talking about maybe this is some sort of indication if he's going to win. Well, there's no indication if he was going to win. It had nothing to do with that. It was some indication of how much people on Twitter, which is a very small self-selected group of people, that we were able to actually quantify, which is an even smaller group of people that you can actually pull sentiment from, happen to like Ron Paul a lot. But people weren't putting that into the proper context. They also weren't putting it was this a question about sentiment or was this a question about interest? And all these types of things are very difficult to do, and these are kind of things we're working on. What we're trying to do is pull out all this social media data combined with other rapidly moving data and putting it into proper context, into kind of three main buckets. One is a prediction of what things are going to happen. Two is an interest index, which kind of says something about how big something is and how long we believe that this event's going to last. So if an issue pops up during a debate, can we put that into context of earlier debates, how big the Twitter reaction was to it or the Facebook reaction to us, and how long we feel it's going to last. And then finally, putting it into a proper sentiment index, which shows things like pretty much every candidate has massively negative sentiment on Twitter. So unless you put that into the context, you're not applying anything meaningful. So if I take those first two steps, then we're going to try to bring into the next two steps, which is kind of infographics and stuff, thinking about how do we get lay people to understand this in a very clean and meaningful manner, and then supply this to outside media. And the reason why we're interested in doing that is to kind of build this feedback loop. And this feedback loop is that the more we can talk about the really meaningful and interesting data that's coming from Microsoft, the more we can get people to supply us data and utilize our systems. But also, the interesting one is kind of that other inner back loop, which is that the more we can figure out how people can understand things, if I can get people to understand a probability distribution, then I can get them to supply me more interesting information. So the work we're going on to create data visualizations that people can understand, it is the same data visualizations that we turn around into these graphical interfaces to get people to supply that information. And so let me talk about the 2012 election then. Let's see here. I know it's always tricky to go live during a talk, but so the outcome of this is that, and these are currently sitting on my personal blogs, but they're going to transfer over to Microsoft Space at some point very soon, is that we're able to turn around real-time and what we believe extremely accurate forecasts of the election. And so this table, along with accompanying map form, is something which is updated every 2 minutes or so. And it's updated with the latest prediction market data and other data that's coming in real time. And we feel like this, as I said, very accurate, but also very meaningful that it comes in when you need it. And what you're going to see from this list of the Electoral College is that you can focus in on this middle section here, which is the swing states. So if you add up everything above that point, you're going to give Romney 191 electoral votes, and everything, so that's everything up to Tennessee, and everything Wisconsin or below is 247 electoral votes for the presidency. Now, I want to make something clear, is that these things are well calibrated. So when I say there's a 77% chance of covering Wisconsin, I do mean that there is a 1 in 5% chance, or almost a 1 in 4% chance the president will lose. But, and this is kind of tricky, and this is really interesting research we're also doing as well, the correlation is such that if the president loses Wisconsin, most likely it's not the swing vote at that point, because most likely if he loses Wisconsin, he's lost a lot of other states as well. And it's just something kind of thinking about, rather than thinking about these independently, your best thing is to think about these almost as a ranking method, and where it's very unlikely that states jump across too many different states. If the president carries Alabama, he's pretty much won the country. But the swing states point to a really interesting thing, which is that the fundamental data, as I said, we looked at this fundamental data that comes up through mid-June or so, and Romney should be winning by all accounts. If you look at just even incumbency against him, but you look at the economic conditions, you look at some of these other kind of raw data that comes in that's not directly related to the campaign. But Romney is getting killed in favorability ratings compared to the president. So Romney's favorability is still sitting around 43, where the president's closer to 50. And the president has extremely high presidential approval for someone in these economic conditions. And what's that translate into is an uphill battle. So if I kind of refocus on here again, as I said, once you get up through Tennessee, that means that Romney's only up to 191 right there. He pretty much needs to carry Florida, which he has a pretty good shot at, but he needs to take Ohio and Virginia, and then he needs to take one of the following 4 states. So that means the president needs to defend either Ohio or Virginia, or just these other states, Iowa, New Hampshire, Colorado, and Nevada, which does translate into what we have right now is roughly a 60% chance of the president winning the election. Now, and I'd say one thing, which I was just talking to Jennifer in the audience about this a few seconds ago. This doesn't, it's kind of scary because it does, rather than kind of adding things to watch, it really subtracts it into a kind of scarily small segment of the country. The Senate list, though, is a little interesting as well. So the Democrats currently have 53 seats, which they're controlling. That includes 2 seats which are technically controlled by independents. Bernie Sanders, who is a socialist, and so he is not in danger of caucusing with the Republicans, and Lieberman, who is an independent but is retiring. And so if you take a look at this list right now, you have to put in mind, though, despite the fact that the Democrats control 53 seats right now, they have 23 seats that are up for election, and the Republicans have just 10. So the Democrats need to think about it in a different way, is that they're going into this election with 30 guaranteed seats, and the Republicans, despite being down, are going into this election with 37 guaranteed seats. So 33 seats are up for grabs, and the Democrats have 30 already right now, and the Republicans have 37. And the really interesting thing is that if you just think binary right now, so if you think the Democrats capture Virginia through Washington, and the Republicans capture Montana through Mississippi, and I'll ignore Maine for 1 second, that essentially gives the the Democrats, that puts at 49 seats, and the Republicans at 50 seats. Maine right now is highly likely to go to an independent, which I have sitting out here because there's only one of them. There you go. His name is Augustus King, and he refuses to say who he's going to, Angus King, sorry, he refuses to say who he's going to caucus with, although he said he's going to vote for the president, so it's likely he'll caucus with the Democrats. And then, of course, there is a 50 first tiebreaker, which is the presidency. And so you have to slide that in there. As I said, about 60% chance that the Democrats control that tiebreaker and about a 40% chance the Republicans control that tiebreaker. What this translates into is simply as tight of race to control the Senate as pretty much possible, essentially 50-50, with races to watch, not that surprising, which is Massachusetts and Virginia, the two races people have been talking about. Massachusetts, which is incumbent Scott Brown, who upset and took Kennedy's old seat after his death, against Elizabeth Warren, who is the popular professor from Harvard who recently ran the Consumer Finance Board, Consumer Finance Protection Board. And then Virginia, which has George Allen, who lost to Webb in 2006 after his racial slur incident running against the former governor, Tim Kaine. Both of these elections, which are essentially toss-ups. So I think that about covers the predictions. So I ran a little long, but does anyone have any questions?
So the deep biasing that you're talking about requires, to do that accurately, requires a ton of prior data.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's like a magic variable that you just...
That's right. And so, which I didn't go into too much, so a lot of this requires a massive amount of historical data, which is one of the major issues when it comes to newer data, social media data, Twitter, et cetera, Facebook. But what we're looking at with polling data, of course, is a tremendous amount of historical information. But then on the other end, you look at something like even prediction markets, and you only have a few cycles of them. So it is something that's continuously updated with each new cycle of information that comes in, which will make us more and more accurate. But it is something that requires historical information. Yes?
We'll think about the methodology there,
yes.
If possible. So I understand this is a regression on all these factors?
Sure.
Essentially, that's the model?
So some of it is going to be kind of straight linear type regressions for very simple things. A lot of things, though, on the probability is looking at probits or logits, which are fairly straightforward as well. Some of them do go a little beyond that. A lot of them have polynomial terms or kind of factorial terms in order to show how essentially the effects differ as you move away from the middle. So I want to give you an example. So when it comes to polling per se, there's this idea called the regression. Essentially, polls which are 10-point leads turn into something like 3-point or 2-point victories on average. But that kind of factor only hits the very high lead ones. It doesn't hit the small lead ones. So there you have a square term and some other things like that to work on that. Mainly, you'd think of debiasing as looking at incumbency, party, but then thinking about how does it change over the days before the election, which is very key. How does it change based off of different election types? And then how does it change, just as I'm saying, when something's very close or not very close? And so working in all those factors, but especially the days before the election is an interesting one because there when you're thinking about combining, you see fundamental data does extremely strong 140 days out, but essentially provides no additional information 10 days out. There you're focusing only on other types of data. So.
Yeah, I actually meant to say overfitting problem. Because given historical data, we can always train the model very well.
Right.
And it works very well up until now. So how are you?
Right. So I think there's kind of a couple of ways in which we've been doing that for depending on the different types of elections. So for some things like the fundamentals or the polling, individually we do have many, many years, and there we're able to very easily drop years and do in-sample and out-of-sample examinations of that. And the same thing even with prediction markets, though. We have in-sample and out-of-sample for anything that we've done, anything that I've done. But more importantly also as well is very cognizant of of this kind of concern. I do end up, depending on if we or me, sorry, if I'm depending on working with someone or not, dropping variables that would, or dropping terms and different conditions that look very strong in sample if they're not working out of sample. And so we've done very strong on that, making sure that we're not overfitting. And it's been a big concern. And so the basic paper that I have on this last kind of combined model, I talk a lot about overfitting and things that I dropped back and scaled back on because I was concerned about it. Yes?
You made a comment about the only thing you were interested was the probability of victory, and the only thing that mattered was whether someone won or lost. But as I look at it, if I'm a marketing manager at Xbox,
Yeah.
I'm really not interested in victory or
Sure.
I'm really interested in actual unit sales.
Yeah, so
Right?
let me answer that question. And essentially, that's for elections. And so for elections, when I was concerned, although everything is run also for that, for historical comparison, what we're working on and what I'm doing a lot more research on, thinking about when it comes to marketing, is actually full probability distributions. Because I think that that is the answer more than even just levels. So again, it's more thinking, what's the relevant thing for the relevant condition? I could be thinking about forecasting the number of sales on Xbox, but and maybe that and a standard deviation, maybe that's the relevant thing. But if the relevant thing's probability distributions, that's what we're actually gunning for, to think, can we actually take that to the next level and get what we feel could be, for some of those things, the actually most, especially if there's a probability of something of a skewed distribution of some sort. So we've been working towards thinking about that. Just what's the most relevant for the right context.
The second question, I think you have an intriguing piece of information about the comparison between prediction markets and polling data, and showed that I think expectations tend to win roughly by a factor of 3 to 1.
That's right.
And that's for about a set of about 80 elections. So is there anything common between those 3/4 of those 80 elections, the 60 elections, or something common about the others, the characteristics of those elections that make one method better than the other?
Well, so the thing which I'm happy to say is that it doesn't, there's different varying sample sizes that occurred in these in different days before the election, and it was not relying on the kind of basic variables that we thought. And so it really cut through fairly consistently. And so I didn't show the slide, but if we broke it up by those major factors, we didn't see anything very, very strong.
I just want to make sure I understood correctly. The more bias or the higher intent, for example, those much more likely to intending to vote Democratic, for example.
Yeah.
Did you say that their expectation is better?
No, so to be clear, so I could take the expectations of just those people who are going to vote Democratic, or just those people who vote Republican, and take that group and de-bias it based off historical data to create a more accurate forecast of expected vote share and probability of victory than I could with essentially just thinking about the intentions of the whole group. But both the Republicans and Democrats were capable of doing it.
When you're talking about gamification,
yes.
You're getting information from me, the player. How do I know if I'm winning or losing?
How do you know if you're winning or losing? So for what we're doing right now, we're running samples generally using Mechanical Turk or other sort of outside groups in which you're knowing you're winning or losing based off of bonuses that you're receiving or based off of points that you're getting in a different game.
So how do you know what points to give me if I'm providing the information to you, right?
Right, so you're providing the information. So generally, in these type of things, you're providing the information on either outcomes that have already happened that you don't know about, or things that are randomly drawn in the future, and then taking that data to provide the points for it.
Are the news media outlets starting to go toward this new method that we can kind of watch as
Sure.
it starts to emerge?
Yeah, so some of them are, including, so I tend to blog on some news outlets, as well as the New York Times has a statistician in-house that does some things in probability, although I'm not a big fan. No, I was, but he's moved away from some of the things. And some other news outlets are starting to kind of refer to a least aggregated forecast or from in-trade prices or Betfair prices or things like that. But I think it's slow because essentially there was always a kind of a lost leader to talk about the latest poll that they're conducting, and they want to conduct these polls and talk about them. So I think what you're going to see quicker and more aggressively is people talking about just raw social media data, because that's kind of the prestige thing for people to talk about now. Whereas it used to be a prestige thing to drop $100,000 on a couple of polls during the course of election. Now they need to have their Twitter guy talking about the latest Twitter reaction to a different event. But so I think people are still far away from it. Still people know this is out there, except they still are just reluctant to kind of switch over.
So I've heard that the polls that are out these days are mostly registered voters, but in the future they're going to start doing likely voters, or
yeah, so it transfers over.
So that could change the poll results.
Well, essentially that transfers over sometime around now-ish, where essentially early in the cycle you're having polling on registered voters, and then you start building in the likely voter models. It actually switches over kind of organically throughout the end of the summer. And what you'll see is going to be a mixed bag, because different companies use different likely voter models, and so it's very hard for them to predict who's going to come out, and a lot of that is where the bias between different polling companies comes in. So you have Rasmussen and some other companies on the right, and that tend to come out with polls of Romney slightly leading, and then you have some polls which are known to have a slightly less bias, and it's all coming from their estimation of who's going to come out and vote, and that's their way for them to kind of cycle that through.
How do the two political camps use their statistics?
Well, they use it increasingly meaningfully, is the short of it. So, 5 or 10 years ago, the basic statistic that people worked on was primary voters. So there was a triple D or triple R, which meant that they had voted in previous election cycles in the primaries as a strong indication. That was kind of the extent of the data mining that people were doing. And now the polling has become ridiculously sophisticated as far as transferring tens of millions of dollars from different states, looking at whether or not it's prediction markets or polling, but more likely it's these internal pollsters that they're hiring, as well as teams of kids, especially on Obama, who are translating Twitter data and other things for whatever they claim they can do. But my guess is that I haven't seen inside any of the campaigns, but I think they probably have a long way to go to actually make it meaningful, but definitely impactful. Meaningful in the way whether or not they're correct, but impactful in the sense that it does lead for a huge amount of investment decisions are being based off of what they can decide on these.
Would they try to hire you and say, "Quit your job, work for us"?
Right. I think Microsoft will allow me would not want me to work for one camp or the other, but anyone who wants to take our publicly available data is more than happy to translate that into investment decisions, I guess.
Are you expanding the expectations model to include the size of my social network? I'm sort of this loner sitting in the basement, and that's my expectation, and as opposed to someone who is a social hub.
No question. So it's been that's kind of future work, which we're really excited about, is weighing people by how many people they know about. So right now we're kind of been torn on it. We've asked people, how many people do you talk to about politics? The numbers actually come out fairly consistently. But then there's, some people are going to say 1,000 people, and some people are going to say 1. And obviously we're not going to weigh people based directly upon that. We also have been working on kind of deducing it from how accurate people can be, and it's been a fun challenge, but that's something where we definitely like to go.
Facebook friends.
Or their Facebook friends. And at the end of the day, the idea is to be able to pull this information more organically. I think the key thing to think about is, like, in 5 or 10 years, is that the idea of an actual poll won't make much sense to people at that time, because it's all going to be ongoing data collection, which is going to be a combination of passive and active data, in which you won't be able to tell the difference. You're not going to realize you were just polled, per se, in the same way that Google and Microsoft and Yahoo and all these companies are predicting things all the time on an individual level. Why wouldn't we be able to do that for elections and other things like that? And so polling from social network data would definitely be part of that as well.
So, one idea that you could do to determine a likely voter would be to ask some kind of a question that somebody who pays attention to the news might know the answer to. Like, you could ask them about this Obama secretary who crashed his car. And if the person knew about that, then maybe they're more likely to be a voter.
There's a massive literature on breaking down political information and what does it mean, and it's actually a very tricky question, because it's not always clear which questions translate into which outcomes, but there's actually a lot of people doing research on those type of things, like which questions can we ask, and then what does that imply if people understand that or don't understand that. And also thinking about people's confidence in those questions is actually where my research has tended towards, though, in that we show that people who are extremely confident in their responses to these political questions are also less likely to be influenced by certain things, and trying to figure out exactly where does all that lie and what do we know.
Let's give Dave a round of applause for Relevant.